started. This should be a little bit clean. All right. Well, welcome everybody. We're talking about an interesting subject, I think, that you might want to know more about, and it gets updated often, and things are still changing, and everything is not completely worked out. And we're talking, of course, about the National Association of Realtors settlement and what that means to you and how it's going to affect our business and what you could do about it. And I've provided a document that I put together, which, let me see if I can pull it up. Yeah. All right, good. All right, so this is what that looks like. And for those of you who don't know what's going on, and a lot of people don't, I've actually had even some people on the team say, hey, I heard about this settlement on commissions. When did that happen, right? And so if this is new information to you, then I'm going to tell you, you're not paying attention to what's going on in real estate, right? You need to read real estate news. You ought to pay attention, right? Because this is like all over the place if you're looking at anything in real estate. To give you an idea of how we got to where we were, a really long time ago, in a place far, far away, real estate agents were paid by the seller, and they represented the seller. An agent who represented a buyer was called the subagent, which meant that they worked for the listing agent, and the listing agent worked for the seller, which means that the agent that looked like they were the buyer's agent really, in fact, worked for the seller. The subagent had a fiduciary duty to the seller, not the buyer, even though they were the one that was showing the property and writing the offers and all that. Well, it came to be in the early 1990s that people said, including the Department of Justice and others, that doesn't seem right, that buyers ought to have their own agents, and that the agent who's representing the buyer ought to really be trying to represent the buyer's best interest. And that around that time, a little bit before, is when agency disclosure became required in California and other states. And so then we have a situation where the agent who's representing the buyer just represents the buyer, usually. They have a fiduciary duty, a duty of faithfulness and fidelity to the buyer. However, they are still being paid by the seller. In other words, the commission that was put into the multiple listing service, the amount that the listing agent was being paid was being shared with the agent who represented the buyer. So this, by the way, is unusual in agency, right? You understand, if you're thinking about somebody negotiating a union contract, it is generally not, confusing who the union reps work for. Somebody negotiating a sporting contract, it's not confusing who they work for, but in real estate, it can be a little bit confusing. The general rule in agency is that your principal is the one who pays you. So if you're representing a buyer, but you're being paid out of the listing agent's commission, it means that the seller is paying you, but you're representing the buyer. This is unusual. I'm just saying that. So what happened is that there were some sellers who, when they realized, they said they didn't know that they were the ones that were compensating the buyer's agent, and the buyer's agent in a few of those transactions were, well, just let's say hostile. And the seller was angry. Why did I pay that money to that agent? All they did was fight with us and try and rip us off and made everything miserable. And they got together and they filed a lawsuit. And with the lawsuit, where we're at right now is that there's a big settlement. The National Association of Realtors, as it says in my handout, has entered into a nationwide settlement on March 15th, 2024. It is not a completely done deal. Now, you might be saying, well, wait a second, Mike, I heard that there was a court and the court accepted the settlement. Yeah, the Department of Justice still may have something to say about it. I'm just saying it's not 100%, 99%. Most people think it's going to go through the way it is, but not necessarily 100%. Now, I'm going to skip back up to some of these points, some of the hyperlinks in a minute. I overdid it a bit on the hyperlinks, but some of the key points is that it releases real estate brokers and members of the National Association of Realtors, which might mean you, right? If you're a member of the MLS and a member of the Association of Realtors, and by the way, some of them were thinking of suing the agents directly for sharing their commission with the agent who represented the buyer. They wanted to sue them directly. If you're a member of the National Association of Realtors, you've been released. If you're a member of any of the large real estate organizations, EXP, Keller Williams, Compass, Coldwell Banker, etc., Anywhere is actually the company that owns. I won't get into that, but they're all part of the settlement. There are a few little brokers of regional size that are still fighting it out with them. And so the two major things that this does is, number one, it removes compensation from the multiple listing service. Right now, if you're showing a house, how much are you going to get paid? Well, it says it in the MLS. Even Zillow and Redfin know how much you're going to get paid, and they put it on their website. Everybody knows what you're going to get paid. And when a listing agent puts in 2.5%, 2.25% into the MLS, this becomes a binding, unilateral, can't change it very easily, offer of compensation. You know, if it says 2.5% and you write the offer and the offer is accepted and it closes, you're getting 2.5%. That's going to change. Right now, it says the change is going to go into effect in mid-July. I have a timeline. It might be late July. There's still some things in play. I have a timeline, that I'll show you soon. And now what you might have heard, and you may be shocked, I was shocked, I have to admit, when I found out that there is a lot of information on the internet that is in fact not true. Is it just me that thought everything on the internet must be true because it's on the internet, right? And if you're looking at what the internet says, it's going to say, oh, buyers agents aren't going to be paid anymore. There's no more 6% commission. There hasn't been 6% commission in a long time. The world is going to go upside down in real estate. Everything's going to hell. That's what it sort of says. It doesn't say, the settlement does not say that a seller cannot pay a buyer's agent's commission. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that you can't tell buyer's agents how much commission they're going to get paid if they write up an offer and it's accepted. It doesn't say that. What it says is that offer of compensation cannot be in the multiple listing service. Could it be on I don't know, if I'm a listing agent and I know a whole bunch of people are going to call me, other agents, wanting to know if they're going to get paid, I could put it on the voicemail recording. When people call me and I say, hey, if you're calling about Starling Drive, I just want you to know that we're willing to pay up to 2.5% compensation to you as a buyer's agent. I could put it on the voicemail message. I could put it in marketing materials. If I go to the board tour, I could have a flyer. It could say on the flyer in great big block letters, 2.5% commission. I could hand it out to everybody. I could do that. I could have certain websites where it lists my properties that I have for sale and it says 2.5%, 2.25%, 2. It says all of that. I just can't put it into the multiple listing service or into a website where there is an IDX feed. Unless a company could do it, like EXP could say, here are all of our company listings and here is the amount of compensation we're willing to pay. We could do all that. We just can't put it in the MLS. Now, does that mean that the second point, you have to have a buyer representation agreement before touring property? What does that mean? Well, it's in the frequently asked questions. Showing property sounds like touring property. How about if I have a live FaceTime, Google Meet, Zoom tour of the property with the buyers? They're not there, but I'm there, and I got the camera going on my phone, and I'm walking them through and pointing out that there's shelves under the stairs and all that other kind of stuff. That actually constitutes a tour. A virtual tour that they just watch is not a tour, but inside the property, walking around with them live, that's a tour. Open houses, sort of, maybe. Where holding an open house and letting people walk through it isn't necessarily a tour, but that's something they're still fighting over, right? Exactly what kind of an agreement do you have to have? By the way, this does not apply to listing agents. Does not apply to listing agents or sub-agents of the listing agent, because they're representing the seller, right? It's only if you're representing a buyer and expecting to get the buyer side, you've got to have a buyer representation agreement. That buyer representation agreement has to discuss compensation. It has to say how much you're going to get paid. It has to say that. And if you're an agent and you put in 2% is what you want to be paid if you represent a buyer, you can't get paid more than 2%. So if you find out that the seller is happy with 2.5%, well, you should have found out, right, before you did that. Now, before you get all weirded out at this point, you can have more than one buyer representation agreement. You could have one, let's say, for every house you're showing. So if I'm showing 4 homes this weekend, I could contact the 4 listing agents and say, hey, how much are you going to pay? By the way, the listing can say in the private remarks, broker friendly, you could say that. The listing can say that the seller is willing to pay a concession to the buyer of 2.25%, 2.5%. It can't say commission or buyer agent compensation, but it can say concession. And the MLSs are changing their software so you could put that in, right? They're changing their software, which is taking them time. Some of this, when you see the timeline, isn't going to be implemented till after July, because the MLSs aren't going to be ready with all the changes. All right. So I could have a buyer rep agreement that says on property number 1, I get 2.5. Property number 2, I get 2.25. Property number 3, I get 2. I could do that. I can amend, modify my buyer representation agreement. So if I start with, I want 2%, but then I've written 10 offers and I'm showing them property every weekend and it's not paying off, I could say, I want more. And we're going to create a new buyer representation agreement. Does everybody get that, right? The contracts can be modified. There's nothing in the rule that says you can't change this. All right. So there's some links here. Going back up to some of these links, the first link I put in is a timeline as promised. Here's a timeline. So the settlement has been signed. April, they got preliminary approval. June 18th, notice it says it's the deadline for Realtor and MLSs to execute Appendix B in order to be included as a release party. That means we promise we're going to follow the rules. This, I'm not going to go into, it's June 18th. Late July, NAR to implement practice changes. It said before middle July, but they keep updating this. Late July. There's a class action thing I'm not going to get into. Notice September 16th, Realtor and MLSs and opting in non-Realtor MLSs and brokers implement practice changes by this date. So what this is sort of saying, notice that doesn't say realtors, September 16th, it says realtor MLSs. So what they're expecting is in late July that we start getting buyer representation agreements before we tour a property with the buyer, and it talks about compensation. But the MLSs aren't necessarily going to have everything ready, changed. And by the way, there could be a listing that was taken in the end of June or early July, and it still says things that pretty soon you're not supposed to say, right? That's fine. And then, but by September 16th, the MLSs are supposed to have their act together. That was the first document. The second document, or link, I should say, is a most recent May 5th, 2024 PDF version of the frequently asked questions. If we go down to the next link, for those of you that don't like PDFs, you'll see this is the NAR Settlement Resources site. And there's fact sheets, and there's a Spanish fact sheet, and the toolkit, by the way, it's not as good as it sounds, right? Basically, it's social media posting that you could do that says the NAR are great people and they're wonderful and we really need them, right? Which is kind of debatable sometimes. But if we go to and there's a financing FAQ for Jody. But basically, so far where we're at with financing, and Jody can correct me if I'm wrong, is that if there's a limit on seller concessions, a seller concession to compensate a buyer's broker is not part of that limit. Is that correct, Jody?
Correct. It's not part of the interested party contributions limit that Fannie has.
Right. So FHA, it's like 6% is the maximum. It could go up to 9% is depending on the kind of loan and other things. So if you were a seller giving 6% for FHA and also 2.25% as a buyer compensation concession to be used for the buyer's agent commission, that's cool, because as long as it's reasonable, normal amounts, right? You couldn't say 20% or something like that, but something that looks like a commission. If you click on the settlement FAQs, here are all the different questions, right? And there's just, I'm not going to go through every one because I want to get down to what we're going to be saying to people, right? And for example, one thing, there's so many of them. What does it mean to tour a home? Right? This is one of the most common things. So first, the practice change, this is paragraph 51. There's a lot of this. Requiring written agreements with buyers is triggered by two conditions. It only applies to MLS participants, that means brokers, working with buyers. Notice working with has a little rabbit ears. What does that mean? Well, identifying properties for them, showing them properties, it goes on. It's distinguished, it says here, is intended to distinguish MLS participants who provide brokerage services to a buyer from MLS participants who simply market their services or just talk to a buyer. So identifying properties, arranging the tour of the properties, performing, facilitating negotiations, that's working with. And that's what it means. What does touring mean? It means that work with the buyer, enter the house. This includes when the participant or other agent at the direction of the participant working with the buyer enters the home to provide a live virtual tour to a buyer not physically present. A home is 1 to 4 residential properties. What about commercial properties? Doesn't cover commercial properties. What about land? Doesn't cover land. I just, was that all right. Somebody thinks it's helpful. That's good. I'm fine. All right, so we're going clicking on different things. This is which one is, oh, this is a LinkedIn. Why did I put this in here? It's sort of the California Association of Realtors, right? Spin. And the reason why I included this is because the California Association of Realtors has their own forms, which you might want to learn how to fill out. And I have put together my own little understanding the NAR settlement, which is something which I give to agents that are interested in joining the team. And we are going to have our own training. The month of June, for those of you that are on my team, is going to be about practicing presentations and scripts and things like that. I'm also willing to actually talk Zoom, phone, or otherwise with buyers and sellers that you're talking to explain this, because I might be, you know, better at it than you. EXP, I'm going to show you, has already produced tools, scripts, and buyer representation toolkit, that sort of thing. So I've included that. Now, this block here, if you're not EXP and you're not in my group, it's not going to help you much, but you can find it yourself, right? If you're not on my team and you're not part of EXP, I don't know what's wrong, right, with you. You know, I don't know what you're waiting for. But one of the things that you might want to do is check out the California Association of Realtors legal department's buyer representation forms free course, free, right? It's an online course, and you might want to take it. You also will find that the Board of Realtors, and I don't know if I put this link, I have a post on it too, but the Board of Realtors everywhere in California, probably everywhere in the United States, is offering a free, it's called Accredited Buyer Representative course, which I've posted before. And if you go into my group on EXP's Workplace, you'll see Become an Accredited Buyer's Representative. It can be done online, and almost all of the associations are doing live classes. It wouldn't hurt for you to spend some time learning about how to work with buyers and how to fill out the forms. I'm just saying, wouldn't hurt. And somebody, all right. So, and if you say, well, I don't have Workplace and I don't have the ability to do any of that stuff, talk to me, right? You're at the wrong brokerage, right? That's all I can say. And I've also included a link to the EXP Marketing Center, which has the buyer agent toolkit, buyer presentations, the buyer roadmap. I've produced my own, which I've also posted on the Workplace group. This might be it here, I don't know. And it's going to be modified in June. Right now, the issue is nothing's changed in the MLS. Nothing's changed for sellers, nothing's really changed for buyers, but it wouldn't hurt you to practice giving buyer presentations. I have one, right? I'm going to be updating it to include the sections on compensation. It's not there now because it's in the MLS. Also would be doing the same thing for sellers. All right. So I already did that. There's some more links. What would you say to a buyer? The buyer says, hey, I hear that I have to pay you and I can't afford to pay you. And, you know, I don't know. Well, first of all, nothing's changed, right? Look at the MLS. It still says you're going to get paid a commission. You should, by the way, learn to explain the benefits of buyer representation. I have a presentation. Jody and I did a home buying seminar. We would do it again, wouldn't we, Jody? We would do it again, right? If you wanted us to do it for you and your group, we would do it again. We got no social life, right? We would do another buyer. We do it again, right? And again, if you had a buyer and you wanted to schedule the time to talk with Jody, she would be happy to talk to your buyers. I would be happy to talk to your buyers. You need, however, at some point to learn how to do this, how to explain a value. And I believe I put the one we did last time on the YouTube channel. You should take the accredited buyer representation class. You should take an agency class, right? Because this whole idea, if I'm the listing agent and a buyer comes to me and the seller says, we aren't going to pay anybody a commission other than you. Right, we're going to talk about that in a minute. And a buyer comes to me and says, hey, you're the listing agent. Can you be my agent? I'm going to say, yeah, yes and no. So if you're really asking, can I help you write up the offer and explain the process? The answer is yes. If you're asking, am I going to be your agent in the transaction? The answer is no. I'm the seller's agent. And I don't want to become a double agent because they shoot them. No, wait, that's something else. A dual agent. I don't want to become a dual agent because it's hard to carry water on both shoulders, right? You know, you got to sort of pick a side. I represent the seller. And so I'll write the offer for you, but you're going to be signing the California Association of Realtors form called Buyer Non-Agency. And what this form says is that even though I'm helping you, I am not your agent. You understand why I don't want to be the agent of both the buyer and the seller. In terms of real estate litigation, there is a highest percentage of lawsuits involve dual agency when you're trying to represent both the buyer and the seller. So that means the buyer is not going to have an agent. And they're going to have a real estate licensee helping them fill out the forms, but that's not the same thing as an agent. Because an agent owes a fiduciary duty, a duty of faithfulness to their principal, and it's very difficult to represent the buyer and the seller at the same time. The seller wants the most money possible and the best terms for the seller. The buyer wants to pay the least money possible and the best terms for, you get the idea. You should take the buyer representation class. That's referring to the forms. You should be studying the real estate market. If you act like or don't know what's going on in Orange County, and that's where you work, you don't know our prices going up, our prices going down, days on, you don't know any of that stuff. You may have difficulty getting a buyer to sign a contract that says they're going to work with you exclusively. And what's going on in the market is something you would want to talk about in a buyer presentation or consultation. You should have a vendor list. Jody should be on it. You should be able to refer a lender to them. You should be able to tell them about inspectors and you should, and I have videos on this, have a list of what is sometimes called allied resources. Part of your value proposition is you've got people that can fix a plumbing leak, do landscaping, etc. Now, under the new regime, how will the buyer's agent get paid? He will either by the buyer directly or by the seller through a concession. We'll talk about that in a minute. I got to go quickly. You can find out before, I already covered this. You can include it in the offer regardless. So even if it doesn't say anywhere that the seller is paying a concession, you can write it in the purchase agreement that the seller is to give the buyer a certain amount. By the way, currently in the residential purchase agreement, paragraph 3G, there's already a place where you could write in that the seller is going to give 2.5, 2.25 to the buyer to compensate the buyers. That you already could write that in. And I already mentioned you could have different representation agreements for different properties. But you're going to have to decide at some point, what's your bottom line? What's the least you would take in order to show a property and represent a buyer? I'm just saying, that's something you might want to have in your mind at some point. So I get questions now about sellers. Somebody says, well, I've got a listing coming up and what should I do? right? Sellers can't pay buyer's agent, sellers don't want to pay buyer's agent, what should I do? Well, first of all, nothing has changed, not yet. You can still have an offer of compensation. Now, a couple of thoughts about this. A lot of this has to do with framing and the way we use words. If I ask the seller, do you want to pay the buyer's agent's commission? Do you want to? Huh? Sound like a good idea? There's a really good chance I'm going to hear no. No, I don't want to. Oh, all right. Well, I guess we're not going to. Now, first of all, just so you realize that today, last month, last year, the seller could have listed their house and in the MLS said 0 is the amount we're going to pay the buyer's agent. 0. They could have done that. They don't. They haven't. And I don't think they will. Not to as great of a degree as being predicted. But they already could do that. But they choose not to. Why? So instead of framing this like, do you want to pay the buyer's agent's, commission? I would frame it a little bit differently. And first of all, you should start using the words cooperating agent compensation. Cooperating agent compensation rather than buyer's agent commission. It's a lot softer. So I would say if the seller says, well, I hear I don't have to pay the buyer's agent, so I don't want to pay the buyer's agent, right? Okay. First of all, let me just be clear on what your goals are. Normally, if you're selling your property, there's 3 goals, right? And they kind of interplay with each other. Goal number 1 is to net the most money. Goal number 2 is to do it within a certain time frame. And goal number 3 is to do it with the least amount of inconvenience. So would you agree that are those your goals, right? Would you agree those are, and they're like, yeah. All right, let's talk about the goal to net the most money. How do we achieve that goal? Well, the answer is we need to expose your property to the greatest number of potentially qualified buyers. Think of it like buying a jacket. You go to the store. You're looking at all the jackets that are on the rack. You find one that looks good. You try it on. It's the right color. It's the style you want. It fits perfect. You look marvelous. But you look at the tag, it's the most expensive jacket on the rack. Do you still buy it? Or do you buy a jacket that doesn't fit very good? It's out of style. Color clashes with your eyes. Most people would buy the more expensive jacket because it fits best. You see, Mr. and Mrs. or sellers, my goal as a real estate agent is to expose your property to the greatest number of potential buyers, because then we'll find a buyer for whom your house fits best. That buyer will pay more money than any buyer. See, we might be able to sell the house to any buyer, but if we can find the buyer for whom the fit is best, they will pay more. Isn't that the goal? All right. So if our goal is to expose a property to the greatest number of potentially qualified buyers, how do we do that? Well, we market it generally to 2 groups of people. Number 1 is the public. And a substantial part of that is putting it on the internet. Last year, in the 2023 National Association of Realtors survey of buyers and sellers, when they asked how did the buyer find the house they bought, 52% of the time they said they found it on the internet. We're going to make sure your home looks marvelous on the internet. There's going to be a walkthrough, a virtual tour, there's video, a single property website, there's going to be professional photographs, and it's going to go on 300 different sites. But the second most substantial way buyers found the home they bought was from a real estate agent that they were working with 28% of the time. And over 90% of all buyers have real estate agents. We want buyers. Buyers want to be represented. So if we say we're not cooperating with other agents who have buyers, we're excluding 90% of the buyers. We've lost 28% of the likelihood that we're going to sell the property. Do you understand that this could put us at a competitive disadvantage? And these comps that I showed you that shows how much your property is likely to sell for, and all of them, they were paying a cooperating agent compensation. They weren't just marketing it by putting it on Zillow, they outreached to other agents. That means we're going to put it on the broker tour. We're going to use reverse prospecting. If you don't know what that is, ask your MLS. It means that we're going to offer a cooperating agent compensation in order to sell the property. Think of it not as a paying an agent a commission, but as a marketing expense. Think of it like that. All right. I would also point out, I would say, well, you realize how much your home is appreciated from when you bought it. You bought it in 1991 for $300,000, right? It looks like we're going to be able to sell it for over $1 million. Now, it might be useful at that time if you could share with the seller what a down payment would look like from a typical buyer buying $1 million house, and what a monthly payment would typically look like. And what would the closing costs likely look like for a buyer that is buying $1 million house? And the point is that it may not be possible for the buyer, in addition to paying the high interest rates, the big down payment, and all those other closing costs. And by the way, outside of Santa Clara County, the buyers pay a lot more closing costs than sellers do. And they're already paying a lot of closing costs. And in addition to that, compensate their own agent. I understand that may not physically be or economically feasible for a lot of the buyers. And so if we push that entirely on them, they might be more motivated to buy a different house because they can't afford it and they want somebody representing them. Now, if the seller says, well, why can't you just do it? Why don't, now just think, you're a listing agent. How much is the listing side commission? Could be 2.5. Sometimes many times it's less, by the way. For those of you that haven't seen a lot of listings, typically the listing agent is getting less money than the buyer's agent. I'm not kidding. The majority, more than 50% of the time, the listing side is skinnier than the buyer side. So why? Because the amount of work you have to do representing a seller is less than representing a buyer. I've had 15 listings at one time. Having 5 buyers would kill you. There's just no way that you could possibly show them all property and whatever. So if I'm telling the seller that I can do the listing side for 1.5, 2, 2.5, or whatever, that doesn't take into consideration that I have to represent all the buyers too. That I have to be the only one that's showing the property. That I have to write, what if we get multiple offers, 10 offers? I have to write all 10 offers. I have to explain the disclosures 10 times to every buyer. So you're asking me not only to do the listing agent job, but the job of all of the buyer's agents. I'll do it, but I want more money. I want a lot more money. I'm going to do it for 1.5 or 2. Not if you're making me do the whole work. You understand that sellers aren't necessarily going to save money if they don't want to compensate a cooperating agent. You understand? What is the goal? Not paying a buyer agent compensation or to net the most money. What's the goal? And one of the examples that I use, and I go through why sellers compensate, one of the examples I use, new home subdividers. So as a seller, I would say, gee, how many homes have you sold? This will be your first one? Second one, maybe? So this is the kind of thing most people don't do very often. Maybe we ought to model ourselves after professional home sellers, people who do this every day, new home builders. Now, just so you understand, a new home builder is not a member of the Association of Realtors or not a member of the Multiple Listing Service, and yet they provide every real estate agent with a website with all the new homes everywhere in the United States. And whether you know it or not, if you're a member of the MLS, you have this site. I've even posted in my workplace group, they have training to agents on how to use the site. They actually provide free training. And if I share that website, which is branded to me, got my picture to a potential new home buyer, and they see a new home they like and they click on it, that lead goes to me, not to the new home builder. And when I connect that buyer to the new home builder is going to pay me a cooperating agent compensation. Why do they do that? Why do you think, seller, why do you think that new home builders make such an effort to cooperate with real estate agents and compensate them? Because they are generous people, charitable, worry that real estate agents don't have enough money to feed their families? Is that why they're doing it, out of the goodness of their heart, or because they know they net more money because they cooperate with real estate agents? How about that? They're business people. They do it because they net more money. Maybe we should, pay attention to that. All right. So cooperating agents are part of the marketing process. Show them how much it's appreciated, all of that sort of stuff. I already covered that. By the way, I'm going to be building, this is from the 2023 National Association of Realtors Home Buying and Seller Survey. What do buyers think about the different sources? Wow, looks like a lot of the buyers used frequently, 65% of the buyers frequently used a real estate agent, 23% occasionally. In terms of what was most useful, 71% of the buyers said that what was most useful was the real estate agent. Do you understand where I'm going with this? Buyers want agents to represent them. By the way, are there buyers? I think I have this up here under the words, if I look for the word retail, here we go. Are there buyers that don't care about having representation, that don't need an agent? Yeah, they're called investors, right? The grizzled investor who's done this 20 times. Sure, they can negotiate on their own. They don't need somebody to help them understand what the prelim says, but they don't offer retail prices either. Right? They don't offer retail, they lowball. They're looking for a discount. They're wholesale buyers. How do we net the most money? We attract retail buyers. And retail buyers have agents and want representation. And if we get rid of them, you're going to meet a lot of investors. All right, and then this is the chart. How did the buyer find their home? Which is hard to read. Mine's going to look nicer when we get to it. All right. Questions about any of this? Let's see.
I have a quick question. Hi.
All right, no, yeah, just jump in.
Uh, thanks. In the list that you had, let me see it, but like things we should be doing, you said take in ABR first, and then yeah, right there, number 3. What's the difference between number 3 and number 5?
So buyer representation class is filling out the form. And the form is the buyer representation agreement. Agency is you learning what the difference is between a listing agent, a buyer's agent, and a dual agent. All right. So what duties does the listing agent have to the buyer? Could anybody tell me? There's two major ones. Three, but one of them is sort of rolled in the other two. Those of you that recently took the real estate exam, I'm going to tell the DRE, you don't know. So the listing agent has a duty of fairness and honesty to a buyer. Fair and honest. That includes the disclosure of material facts. But to the principal, which is the seller, they have a fiduciary duty. Fiduciary comes from a Latin word fides, like Fido, the dog, right? They called the dog Fido because dogs were faithful, right? That's where fidelity comes from, the same word that fiduciary comes from. So your duty to the principal is one of faithfulness, but your duty to the third party is simply fair and honest. Can you be honest and not faithful? Is there a difference between being fair and faithful? An example is, and by the way, in my buyer representation presentation, I go through the differences. So if I'm representing the seller and I know that the seller needs to move really bad, I can't tell the buyer that. Confidential information. If I represent the buyer and I'm talking to the neighbors and the neighbors say, hey, that guy's got to move, we know it. I not only can tell the buyer, I have to tell the buyer. Because the confidentiality rules don't apply to me if I'm representing the buyer. That's a seller thing. So if I'm faithful to the seller, it means that if I know that there are some comparables that would indicate we've priced it too high, I don't tell you if you're the buyer. And when we write up the offer, we write the offer so the terms are best from the seller's point of view, not the buyer's. You see, there's a difference between what duties are owed depending on whose agent you are. Oh, well, anyhow, so the buyer representation agreement is what you would do after you've explained to them why they want to have their own agent. Aisha.
Yes, just backing up a little bit to what you were saying. I've seen real estate ads and property advertised as buyer needs a quick sale, buyer's moving, buyer
Seller
anxious to
needs a quick
sell.
sale or seller's moving.
Yeah.
They did that because the seller told them that they could.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
So if the seller says, tell people I'm in desperate, well, that's fine. Right, but the thing is, let's say the seller didn't tell you to tell people that and you told them anything. So the buyer says to you, well, you've listed it for 1.2 million. Are they firm? How much do you think the seller would take? I'm not supposed to say, well, we've listed it for 1.2 million, but the seller said just the other day that 115 and it's a done deal. I can't do that if I represent the seller, but I can if I represent the buyer. See, it might be good for you to be able to articulate what the difference is between somebody having their own agent and versus somebody not having their agent, where the only agent in the transaction is representing the other side. If you were getting divorced, would you use the same attorney your spouse was using to save money? Think of all the money you'd save. You don't even have to hire a lawyer. Right. The other lawyer will do all the work. Isn't it nice? I see most people get it, that that's probably not economically sound. All right. Other questions? If you need me, if you're on my team and you need me or Jody to help you with a buyer appointment, right? We're here for you. Isn't that right, Jody? Why don't you, have I given you enough time?
Mhm.
All right, so why don't you, tell us our loan, well, I'm not gonna say that. What's the interest? What's happening?
What's your interest rate?
Yeah.
Well, we all saw interest rates jump up quite a bit back in April, and I'm happy to say that they've come back down a little bit in the last about 4 days. Not back to where we were earlier this year. In the kind of the mid sixes is where we were at. But we jumped up a little bit over 7%. And when I say we, I'm talking about the industry, not necessarily Rocket. And this is just your standard Fannie Mae 30-year fixed all across the country average. When you get down into the specifics of someone's actual interest rate, it could be higher, it could be lower, based on several factors: credit score, loan type, property zip code, even property type, things like that. But we did see that interest rates fell from the average of 7.29 to 7.18 this past week. So that's really good from where I sit. I have locked a few purchases here lately under 7%, and that's a good thing for me. If I've got a 6 in front of something, I'm happy for right now. Now, we all wanted the Fed to start dropping rates this year, but that is not happening. And there's a little bit of chatter that maybe in July the Fed will drop a quarter. I'll believe it if I see it. I'm not putting any hopes in that. I'm anticipating more that we're looking at a fourth quarter drop, maybe right before the election. And call that what you want. It's not supposed to be a political move, but who knows what they do and why they do what they do. But the economy is still relatively strong, considering where we've been and with inflation and everything. We've got a 3.9% unemployment rate. That is fantastic, but that's not good for inflation. So anytime the employment rate, we get those new numbers and they're really good, unfortunately, the Fed says, no, we're not where we need to be yet. So we're not going to start reducing rates. Of course, there's a slew of other measurements that they take to make the final decision of what they do with rates. But unemployment is a pretty good indicator of what's going on with the economy. Core retail spending was up over 1%. And personal spending was up almost 1%. So what we're seeing is people are spending money, they're putting money in the market. They accumulated quite a bit of savings during COVID, and now they're spending it. If you guys have seen that there's a rise on the buy now, pay later side of credit, and people are taking advantage of that quite a bit. That is new. That has definitely helped with consumer spending. Consumers are pretty much maxed out on credit cards. And we're seeing people taking equity out of their homes. Refinances are up about 30%. They're taking equity out of their homes to pay down those high interest credit cards and personal loans. You say, okay, well, I'm sitting here with 3.5% interest rate. Why would I refinance this? Well, yeah, that's a great rate. But if you're paying 20-30% on credit cards and you want to get into a better financial position, maybe 6.5 or 7% on your new mortgage is okay. It actually is. That may sound crazy to some people as a solution, but it is a good solution if you're in a situation where cash flow, you're just crippled by it, and the high interest rate, credit cards are killing you there. Tapping into your home's equity can make sense. Now, you don't have to do a full cash out refinance, but considering where prime is right now, HELOCs, loans are 9-10%. So don't be shocked when you get those quotes from lenders. Those are high because prime is high. Then the consumer says, all right, well, I could take, $100,000 off and pay, 10% on that, or, roll it in and pay, 6.5 to 7%. That sometimes seems a bit better. So we're probably not going to see any major interest rate movements anytime soon. Again, I'm thinking maybe beginning of fourth quarter, we'll start seeing the drop, but I think that we will start seeing a drop then. Good news is purchase applications were up about 2% last week, but still down 17% from last year. Refinances up 5%. down 6% from last year. I'm sorry, I told you 30% before, but that is actually Rocket's stat. So we're doing about 30% refis right now. Interest rates fell. I told you that. I'm in the high sixes right now on just your standard Fannie Mae loan. That's not including any of the loan level price adjustments that Fannie could offer depending on income and census tract and all that. So the interest rate could be a little bit better. One thing that I've seen a rise in popularity with my clients is they are wanting the verified approval letter that I told you guys about previously, which just basically means I am taking all of their income and asset documents and pulling their credit report, and I am sending it into underwriting right away. So they get a fully verified letter. It enables you to check on the box on the offer that the loan has been underwritten. It's not just a pre-approval, it's a full underwrite. That's where we can come in with a 10-day close if you need to compete with cash. I've got several borrowers who have lost bids because they cannot compete with cash. So, and they go, well, I don't want my credit pulled. Well, we're going to pull it because you can't sit there and not want your credit pulled, but you're going to end up losing, the house that you really want. So let's get the credit pulled. Your score will rebound in 120 days or so. It's not that big of a deal, maybe 4 or 5 points if it even moves. Let's get you in to compete with cash. I want to help people get into the house they love, not the house they like, right? And I know that's what you want to do as well. And we have to be very competitive right now. Multiple offers, it's happening. I think you and I, we have all talked about how people are like, well, I'm going to wait till interest rates go down before I buy. And I'm waiting for property prices to reduce. It's not happening. And it's not going to happen. Property prices are going to continue to rise. We're estimating between 3 and 5% appreciation just in the Bay Area. Now there are pockets where there'll be more and there are pockets where it'll be a little bit less, but that's still on average a pretty good deal considering even where interest rates are right now. We are by no means the highest we've ever been. As a matter of fact, we're back in the levels of, I want to say like the mid 2000s. When I got into mortgage, 6.25 was a normal rate. 6.5 was a normal rate. If I'm at 6.99 right now, that is not crazy. So when you're out there talking with your clients, if they bring up any interest rate objection, please bring me into the conversation. I am happy to provide numbers, estimates. I've developed a couple of closing cost worksheets last night that I can send out that will help, and showing them what a payment would look like now, knowing that most likely, keep your eligibility in check, keep the payments made and credit, where it should be. And we'll refinance this probably within the year. So I'm not going to call it short-term financing because lenders don't like that because they lose money if a loan is refinanced within 24 months. Every loan is a loss. Another reason you're seeing a little bit higher interest rates right now is because lenders are trying to recoup a little bit of the loss that they're going to go ahead and have anyway, knowing that these loans are going to be refinanced within 24 months from here. So I know that was a lot. Don't want to keep you guys too long. You've got my name and number. I work evenings, weekends. Do not hesitate to call me with anything, any challenge. If you've had people declined in the past, I don't care what their credit score is. I will work with them. I'll put them through our free credit upgrade program, no cost to them, get them where they need to be. There's a lot of people out there that still want to buy. There's still challenges. I'm here to help everyone home. So give me a call anytime.
Thank
Thank
you. So I don't know if Angela Williams is still here, but she asked a question, I just saw it, about is there a negative connotation to display ABR accredited because NAR, the Guild by Association. First of all, let me say it isn't a piece of paper that lists your value proposition. It isn't all of the accreditations you have. It's your ability to have conversations with the buyer, to instill confidence, and to show them that you know the market. If you were to ask me what is one thing that you could do more than any other thing that would help you do this, it would be previewing properties that are for sale in the area that you work, so that you actually see them and you know what they look like at that price point, whatever, and you can talk about it and to know the market. The other thing I would say is most people don't know what NAR stands for. They don't know what ABR stands for. They're not outside of real estate. This is all murky. They don't really care. So it's not like they're going to hold it against you. And it isn't the designation That's why I wanted you to do it. It's so that you would learn more about how to present value to a buyer. She also asked the question about buyer non-agency. We write up the forms without an agent. We're the listing agent, but what if the buyer sign a BPA and we locate the house that is FSBO? What is a BPA? Broker price? I don't know. And we've been for sale by one. So I'm not entirely sure that's a form that doesn't just jump to my mind. If you're representing a buyer and it's not in the multiple listing service, we use something called a single party compensation agreement, which is an agreement that the seller makes to pay a commission. It's not a listing agreement. It simply says, I agree to pay you X amount of money. Because it's not in the MLS, if it's a for sale by owner, it isn't covered by these rules that we've been talking about. And if it gets down to specifics, we'll talk about how to write up the contract. And by the way, I'll give you one final, I'll cast one final pearl, all right? If I'm talking to a seller and the seller says, I don't want to pay another agent's a commission. I don't want to. I'm against it. I don't care, which all that stuff you said. This is what I would say. Is it okay with you if the buyer pays their own agent compensation? Is that okay with you? Is that the buyer pays? Do you have any problems with the buyer paying? And they say, well, no, that's what I meant. That's what I just said. I don't want to pay. The buyer has to pay. All right. So, by the way, technically, historically, who pays the buyer's agent's compensation? And the answer is it's the buyer. Even today, last week, last month, last year, it was the buyer. How much money does a seller put into escrow? Well, unless they're upside down because the loan is greater than the value, the answer is they don't put any money in. So all of the money that goes into escrow comes from the buyer in the first place. So I would say, well, what if the buyer just worked it into the offer? Would that be okay? I mean, let's say they raise the price in order to cover the compensation to their agent. That wouldn't bother you, would you? Would it? You could do that, couldn't we? And then they almost always say, by the way, I have some experience with this. And they say, well, sure, yeah. So basically what we're doing, and for those of you left early, you're missing it, is what we're doing when we represent a seller is we're going to run a net sheet. Buyer makes an offer. Buyer says, I want 2.5% as a concession so I can pay my agent. We put that in the the seller's net sheet. And then rather than talking about all the details in the net sheet, I would be pointing at the bottom line number. You're going to net this amount. How's that look? Will that get you where you're going? Is that good for you? You like that number? And if they say yes, great, let's sign the offer. We're done. Let's go, right? Buyers always have paid their own agent's commission. That's where all the money comes from. It's built into the price. That I don't think is going to change. All right, that's it. Enough preaching for today. Everybody, next week, I'm going to talk about the listing presentation side of it. And some of these things I haven't completely modified because, it's, they're changing the rules. And right now it's under the current rules. And so the presentations are still reflecting what we're doing now, but next week we'll be updating it a little bit more. Tomorrow I'm talking about the Realtors Property Resource. You might want to participate in that. Some of those reports and information would be used in a buyer or seller presentation. You might want to know about it. That's it. That's all I got.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Mike.
This is the time to say thank you, everybody, and goodbye. Thank you.